Gwen Strauss, thank you so much for accepting this conversation. And of course, we are going to talk about your book, The Nine, which has caused quite some stir in Romania as well, as it happened in many countries of the world. It's not just another story of the Holocaust, but it's a particular one because it concerns a different aspect, which is not exactly or not only the concentration or the labor or the death camp, but also the march from there towards liberation, towards a new phase in someone's life. Now, of course, this book is mainly historical truth, intertwined with some fiction, obviously. My first question concerns your first meeting of the actual story. How did that happen?
Yes, that was really sort of an astonishing part for me. I was having lunch with my great aunt Ellen Podliaski and with my grandmother. And Ellen was at that time in her 80s. I think she was around 83. And I had known her all my life as a very elegant, very discreet, and highly intelligent woman. And during that lunch, she started to tell me this story about her arrest and about her work in the resistance. And then she told me how she had escaped with a group of women, and I was just astonished because I didn't know any of that. I vaguely knew that she had been in the resistance, but really was not something we talked about in the family. So that was kind of I was so surprised.
Was she the one who started actually this conversation, this story? Yes?
Yes, yeah. And what's interesting about it too is that she hadn't talked about it with anyone in the family. I mean, perhaps she talked about it with my uncle, my great uncle, and probably my grandmother, but it wasn't something that we spoke about. And I know for a fact that her daughter, her own daughter, didn't know the story or anything about it. So I felt ready to talk about it 60 years later. And I asked if I could come to her apartment and record it because it seemed so important to me, this story, which I did with another member of my family. And we made a transcript, which she corrected, and then kind of left it at that. I didn't think initially that I would make a book out of it. I just thought I wanted to make sure the story wasn't forgotten.
How do you recall her telling this story, reliving this painful past that she was actually sharing with you?
Yeah, at lunch, she seemed ready to talk about it. And also, I was curious, and maybe my kind of American side, which is kind of really, overly enthusiastic or whatever, that encouraged her to be more forthcoming. But I think she had just reached a point in her life when she was finally ready to talk about it. When I went back later to record the story, she had obviously been thinking about it more, and she had some sort of things ready to show me. She wanted to show me her military awards, and she had I could tell that she had really thought about what she wanted to say, and she was ready. Yeah.
There is this different approach for everyone who has dealt with this kind of horror in telling the story, whether you have this availability in sharing the facts, in sharing the memories, in sharing also the sensations, the actual sensations, or on the other hand, is this extreme sometimes reluctance, because there is a certain fear that no one else could actually relate to, or at least understand this kind of context, this kind of episode in one's life.
Yeah, I think that's especially true when you're talking about women, especially young women from her generation. There was definitely a taboo around the subject after the war, and it was something that many women just pretended hadn't happened because they didn't, for many reasons. I think partly the feeling was, as you said, nobody would, but other comrades would understand what they'd been through. And they initially faced quite a sort of backlash when they returned home and talked about it. They were told to come on, let's go forward with life. That's in the past, let's forget about it. And I think as women and as young women, Most of them were unmarried, etc. They wanted to have a life. They wanted to find a husband and have children, or find a partner, that kind of thing. And so insisting on this sort of heavy past felt as an impediment to that. They had to really let it go. They were told specifically to let it go, just to not talk about it.
Well, you had one story, Helen's story, but in the book there are other 8 stories. How did you embark in the journey in order to discover these particular stories, to intertwine them?
Yeah, that was really the fun part for me. So I had Helen's story, and 2 years after Helen told me her story, I stumbled across a book that was written by another member of the group, the one who's called Zaza. And I didn't realize it was the same story. I mean, it seemed like the same story, but not quite. And there was no one named Hélène, and there was, so I gave it to Hélène to read, and she confirmed that indeed this was her friend Zaza, and that was the group, and that she was called Christine, and that she was known as Christine. It was her nom de guerre, and that was how I would find her in the Nazi records as well. They knew her as Christine, not as Hélène. So from Zaza's book, I was able to find out that there were 9, because actually Hélène couldn't remember how many there were. And I was able to find out that there were 6 French and 2 Dutch and 1 Spanish, and a little bit about their ages and their nicknames. And then I slowly I took a trip to Germany, and I went into the archives and slowly was able to piece together who was who. Really, the big help also was when I started to contact the families of the women that I knew. And sometimes they would say, oh, that her real name is, for example, there was one named Mena, and I couldn't find her anywhere. And then when I found Gigi's family, they said, oh, but Mena's real name is Yvonne. And then they knew her, and I contacted her family. So it sort of went like that, one after another. A lot of working in the archives, a lot of reading Nazi lists and sort of searching through transport lists and trying to piece together who could be the right age with sort of the right name and was in the same group. They were all together in the same block. So eventually I was able to figure it out, but it took some detective work, which was very exciting.
Exactly, that sounds like a journalistic investigation.
Yes.
Were there difficult parts? Have you at a certain point felt, I don't know, maybe impeded, maybe drawn back in your research?
Yeah, there were several difficult. Of course, it's a difficult subject, and some of the research, specifically, I would say about Ravensbrück, which was the first camp that they were sent to. I figured out, and this is a camp that was built only for women, and it's just an hour and a half north of Berlin, and is the second largest camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau, an enormous camp complex that was, by the end of the war, a death camp. There were gas chambers, and there was quite some, when they show up in the camp and the time that they're in the camp, the conditions were terrible there. And there was also terrible treatment to sexual violence, but also terrible treatment of pregnant women and terrible treatment of children. And that was very, very painful and difficult to read about, and then to try to imagine in the lives of these women. There was also difficulties in the detective work, if you will, or the journalistic research, in that some of them were easier to find than others, and one of them remained a little bit, I haven't found as much about her as the others. And that, I feel always, I'm hoping that someday somebody will contact me and say, I have more information about her.
Well, as you have mentioned already, Ravensbrück was the second largest camp in that time. Still, if we think about the camps, the World War II camps in general, there is always one name that pops up more than anything else, which is Auschwitz-Birkenau. Okay, so basically almost no one seems to be talking about Ravensbrück. Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, it's interesting, especially because, well, there's all kinds of reasons why, but I think again, going back to what I said earlier, one of the reasons that Ravensbrück was particularly forgotten and sort of erased somewhat from the history of the camps or the memory of the camps is that it was a camp only for women. And many of the women who survived, when they went home, didn't talk about it. And I suspect, and I'm pretty sure, for example, that one woman of the 9, José, I think she denied that she was ever there. So none of her family even knew that she was there. Because it was such a, marriages were called off, and it was just a taboo. Immediately after the war, Ravensbrück was on the, Eastern Germany, and it was the Soviets flattened it. So they were going to build a shopping mall on it. A group of survivors in Germany, women, stopped that. But the camp almost didn't survive as a kind of memorial site at all until, with some growing activism, and survivors from around the world fought hard to keep it as a memorial site. So, and of course, as many of the camps in the East were remembered only as memorials of communism against fascism, and the memory of Jews or lesbians or all of those other things didn't figure in the memorials up until really the 80s and 90s. And that's particularly true in Ravensbrück, where I think it was just a kind of shameful. Even the Germans actually were worried that the German SS, I'm saying, like the German Nazi authorities, were worried that that a camp like that on German soil, doing those kind of things to women, would be so appalling to the German population that they, more than any other camp, they destroyed all the records. They tried to keep all the records of what happened in Ravensbrück out of public eye during the war and after the war.
It's also, since you're talking about this camp only for women, it's also a book about an unseen and an untouched aspect of the Nazi extermination, which is the pregnant women that arrived in the camp and the children born within the camp.
Yeah, I would say that was the most difficult part of my research. The part where I would have to put down the research and walk away and go for a long walk in the woods and try to,
clear your thoughts.
Clear my thoughts, because there were some incredibly cruel things done to pregnant women and also to women giving birth, and then the children immediately afterwards. A lot of women arrived in the camp pregnant because there was a lot of rape of women by soldiers. So once they were there, they would find themselves pregnant. And then for a certain part of the time in the camp, you weren't allowed to have a child, so there were abortions carried out, obviously not well, and obviously women would die of those often, and they would be brutal and terrible. There was also then later in the camp, they allowed women to have children, but they didn't do anything for the children, so the children were put in a sort of maternity ward with no food and no real facilities, and so the children died. In fact, it's estimated that over 500 babies died during that time, basically starved to death. So it's very, very dark part of the story.
Yes, we all know from dozens and dozens of books or movies or documentaries or even first-hand accounts, the daily life within a camp, whether it was Auschwitz-Birkenau or Bergen-Belsen or Dachau or Treblinka or Ravensbrück. But still, your book is also about a specific time after the destruction of the camp. And this is something many tend to ignore or to forget. Most of us think that once the camps were liberated, everything turned out to be somehow fine, let's say. But then again, your book is about this march, this 10-day journey from Ravensbrück towards a certain destination that our readers will discover. What do we tend to forget about this post-liberation specific time?
Well, I mean, it was incredibly deadly and dangerous, first of all, because between the moments, this happens really in April, the factory where they've been forced to, as slave labor has been destroyed by the Allies. And so the Nazis have put their prisoners on these death marches that have been called death marches because over a third died during this very short period of the war, either in mass executions or they died from starvation. They just dropped dead. There was no food, there was no plan. Already Auschwitz had been emptied in January with the coming of the Russian troops. And many of those prisoners, some of those women, had ended up in the same labor camp with my group of 9 women.
Yeah.
So they knew this is what was headed, that they were headed to. And once again, they get pushed out into this march. It's snowing, it's spring, but it's really cold. They have no real footwear. They're all sick. One has tuberculosis, one has diphtheria, one has a broken foot, the other has just recovered from pneumonia. They've already just spent over a year in concentration camps, malnourished, etc. So you can imagine what that, and then there's no food and there's no water and there's Allied bombings and there's, the women decide at this point to escape from this death march because they know if they continue, they will be killed, which is in fact what happened to the women that stayed with the group. A few days later, we know historically that they were all killed in a field. And then it's just chaos. I mean, the countryside of Germany at this point is completely bombarded. There's no food. There's panicked Germans. There's fleeing SS. There's fleeing Nazis, German soldiers who hate the SS. There's the Russians coming from one side, the Americans or the Allies coming from the other side. So it's just a kind of, it's almost like a Brechtian play, and they have to figure their way home. I think for me, it reminded me a little bit of Homer's Odyssey, because it's sort of this story of a group of soldiers, because really these young women were soldiers trying to find their way home from a war. And that even, what was interesting for me is that even afterwards, when they finally get to Paris, they have, it's not over. There's a kind of, how do you really come home from a war? How does one heal from a war? How does one come home? And again, what you were saying earlier is very true. They've had this really intense experience as a group of women together, as a group of friends. And maybe they're never going to have that kind of intense friendship again. There's a kind of loneliness as well when they get home, I think.
There's no way none of us can actually put herself or himself into the shoes of someone who has lived the Nazi terror the way these survivors did. What have you learned about the resilience of the human soul working and writing on this book?
Yeah, I wanted to say that because I feel like I've been focusing too much on the dark side, because the other part of this journey for me as a writer was how amazing some of the stories of courage and self-sacrifice and really friendship, how important friendship was for them, sticking together. And I found that women, even in the camp and then in the labor camp and then even on the march, they found all kinds of ways of resisting that I wouldn't have considered resistance. Like, for example, you read about in my book the reciting of recipes to each other.
Yes.
That was just a beautiful way of being together, and believe it or not, as they're starving, it's comforting for someone to describe every single step of making some kind of meal, and they would consider it as if they had eaten a meal together. Or they just did these beautiful acts of solidarity. They did poems and they stole paper, and there was room for art and creativity. In fact, art mattered. It was primordial for their, because resistance for them as women meant having, sticking together, having friendships, and having dignity as maintaining their humanity. And I was really moved by that. I'm moved by the creativity that they showed in finding ways to keep going.
I'm sure that you, as an author, have read many of these books. Most of them are worldwide famous. From the late 40s up until today, there are generations already of books and authors dedicated to this particular time in human history. But also from the point of view of the author, in which way did you feel that you have grown or mature as a writer within the boundaries of the story?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question. First of all, it gave me a feeling that I hadn't had before, that it matters to tell stories, and that it matters to keep the stories alive and to pass them on. I'm of the generation that's a witness of the witnesses. I'm no, I'm that, almost all the survivors are passed away now. So we have to, these stories are of vital importance. The specific story, but also in the general story of humanity and resilience and friendship and solidarity and all those things. And I think I could be sort of somewhat blasé or cynical as a writer before. And then doing this story and meeting some of the families and bringing the stories to them and hearing their stories has made me realize that we as human beings, we need stories. That's like how we understand each other and how we have hope. And I believe that hope is sort of the radical act that we all need to try to generate. And so I feel like writing and keeping these stories alive is part of that.
It's not an easy book. It's not easy to read it. It's not easy to live up to a certain extent the lives of these 9 women. Were there moments in writing the story when you said to yourself that it was maybe too much, too hard to handle, that you wouldn't believe that you would last up until the end to write it?
Well, like I said, there were certain parts of the research that I found really hard to handle. I actually found writing it, believe it or not, it was a kind of a joyous thing, because it was one of these times as a writer where each story led me to another story, and I felt almost guided. Every time I hit a wall and didn't know what to do, or as I often have and continue to have, when I was really doubting myself and thinking, oh, I'm not capable of this, this is too important of a story for someone like me to be writing, or, who am I to be writing this, or, any of those kind of questions one can have. Something would happen. Some little, one of the relatives would suddenly an envelope would arrive in my mailbox with photographs that someone had sent me of one of the women. And I'd realize, like, oh, they're trusting me to tell this story. I have to keep going. So in a lot of ways, this experience was really a happy experience despite the subject. Because I felt so empowered by the families of these women, and I kind of felt like happy is not the right word, but it is a story of bravery and courage, and I felt proud to be able to tell it.
We may have the impression that about the Holocaust and about the Nazi extermination, everything was said. Still, look, there are books like yours that show us different aspects, different facets, different sides of this universal horror, probably the most important or the capital horror of the 20th century. Is there something always new to discover about such a well-known story?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it was something I have to admit that when I first started on this, it sort of held me back, because I thought, well, it's kind of already been told, and even my agent was sort of, another book about this. But what I did find, and I think is really true, is that there's a lot of stories of women that haven't been told, and there's a lot of the marginal people that haven't. And there is, we always exist in relationship to history. It's not a set point, and then you finish telling it, because history really exists only as we remember it, and our memory changes in relationship to where we are. So the story that we can tell today is not the story that we could have told 20 years ago, or what we can tell from 20 years from now. And that's kind of the beauty of storytelling, is that it is exactly what we need at each moment, and it's in play with memory, but memory is not a fixed thing, if that makes sense. I mean, so it's a constantly evolving, constantly moving. So yes, I think that there is an endless source of story.
Gwen, last question. What would Helen say about the book?
Oh gosh, that's so scary. She was a really incredibly intelligent, elegant, super well dressed.
Yes.
Gorgeous, everything.
You depict her so French, so classy, so refined, so poised.
Yeah, she was very humble. So I don't know how she would feel. But I hope that she would be happy and proud. I think she was very proud of her group of friends. So I hope so.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's wonderful, Marius. Thank you.
Thank you.